My name's James and I run The Distant Vale, which is a small commission painting studio based in New Zealand. And today I'm just doing a little foray into YouTube. So we're going to do a little painting tutorial on how to paint a beautiful, beautiful miniature by Skullforge Studios and see how many times I can say beautiful in one video. We're going to paint him in quite a muted style using the Vallejo colour palette. And without further ado, let's get started. Beautiful, beautiful sculpt. It's been printed in ABS-like black resin by Sunlu. Some layer lines from the auto-generated supports that were put on, but to be honest with you, I don't think you're going to notice after a decent coat of paint on it. So I've decided to print Skullforge's bust set, like diorama set, sorry, in maybe 3 different pieces, purely because it's going to be easier to paint. So what we're going to do is we're going to stick a pin in the bounty hunter's feet, and then we've printed a base. But what we're going to do is we're going to be a bit more creative with this, and going to maybe stack some cork underneath it and make it a bigger one. And then finally there's the smokestack, which is going to go into the back of his jump pad, like so. So let's get to it and put it all together. You know what? We can do better than that. Let's take a little bit of a MDF base. Just get ours from Battle Kiwi most of the time. With this, we have some cork. So you can get cork from all sorts. I mean, I know Squidmire uses IKEA mats. We haven't got IKEA in New Zealand. Cheapest stuff I can get actually from train shops, so it's HO scale track supports that you just snap in half and then break up into little pieces, and it's quite good texture and it breaks down pretty well. We're just gonna take some PVA. I mean, look, you can use super glue if you really wanted to, but to be honest with you, if you drop it, super glue is going to crack. PVA is going to swell into the cork, absorb, and hopefully give a little bit more flex. It is going to take longer to dry, but what it's not going to do is hopefully break if it ever gets dropped. I mean, this is going to be a display piece anyway, so I'm hoping no one drops it, but you never know with these things. So we're just going to take a load of pre-mixed cork, pre-cooked cork, and we're just going to randomly lay it on. We're going to let it dry first, and then we're going to cut it down a little bit later. So we're just going to be a little bit haphazard about it. Doesn't matter if it overlaps the size of the base. We're only using the base as a template. And we're going to go back at it with a little bit of... yeah, that'll do for now. We're going to go back over it later with some either green stuff or epoxy. Might end up using Tamiya modelling clay actually, but we'll decide that close to the time. So with these things, there are options where you can like pin it and stuff like that. This is actually really easy to do if you have styrofoam or XPS foam. It's probably easier to do with XPS foam, but unfortunately I've not got any on me at the moment, so I'm relegating myself to using a little bit of cork. And all we're going to do is we're just creating these odd steps, and we're going to add different shape to it. And I think we'll add one final piece. Just over the top. And as I say, that's going to look pretty cool if we then, and that's going to look pretty cool when we add a little bit of the clay. We've got around to it. We've let the PVA dry a little bit, and we've mixed up a little bit of Tamiya 2-part epoxy putty. And what we're just going to do is we're just going to look around the base and see where we might potentially just want to add little bits. So if you look just in there, there's a little crack. We could just leave it as a little bit of a crevice, not too fussed about that. But what we do want to try and change is where there's obvious things like this flat line here, because I needed a bit of space to glue. I'll just stick a little bit of epoxy putty down. And what we're going to do is we're going to do this as a method of just creating a slightly smoother finish. So now that we've gone down that straight edge, we're just going to go around adding a little bit of putty, making the smokestack try and fit into the environment a little bit. And then once we've done that, we're going to get our silicone sculpting tool and try and make them into slightly more rock-like shapes and just sculpt it into the environment a little bit more. Neat little trick with this is using a little bit of Vaseline on your tool. So I just put a bit on the back of my glove and it just helps the tools smooth over the putty a little better. Now that we've got the base sorted, we're going to move on to priming. So we're going to prime the base in the miniature with an initial black prime of Vallejo Mecha Black, and then move on to a slight zenithal. I'm not going full white zenithal on this because I want to paint it in quite a muted style, so I'm going to use a grey primer by Vallejo again. Now then, let's get started painting the base. We're going to start with a smokestack. We're going to use some Vallejo white thinned down, and we're going to highlight the top, the hottest part of this smoke that's going to be coming out the exhausts of the Bounty Hunter's jetpack. Now that we've finished putting these white highlights, we're going to move on to moving further down the smoke column. And I'm going to start using a little bit of Vallejo Sun Yellow and Moon Yellow. So Moon Yellow first, and then a little bit of Sun Yellow, which is more of an orangey colour. Now with this, we're going to continue moving down the column, just doing a really rough wet blend. I'm going to start using a little bit of hot orange and gory red. We might even mix a little bit of black into the gory red. And we're just going to keep going until we get a really dark maroon colour. So that transition from white to yellow all the way down to a red and into a black. Now one of the things to remember with this wet blending is you need to follow the shape of the smoke. So follow all the different crevices, try and end up with a little bit of the darker in the recess and continue your way down, trying to just blend those edges until you get to the bottom, but we're going to tie it all in a little bit more later. Now we're at the bottom of the smokestack, we're going to use a little bit of Black Templar Contrast by Citadel, and we're just going to base the bottom of the smokestack with that contrast paint. After this, we're going to move back to the top of the column and going to start highlighting into some of the recesses a little bit more white to show the heat. And we'll next move on to using a little bit of fluorescent orange, really thinned down as a little bit of a glaze over the whitest points near the tips that are actually going to be coming out the jumper. Moving on to the fun stuff, we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo Black and dry brush over the smoke column, trying to get a little bit of that dirty look like the exhaust is sending some of the plumes out. Continuing on with the dry brush, we're then going to use a series of different brown tones, depending on what colour the base you want to, and we're just going to stipple them on with a extra large Artis Opus brush. Using some Vallejo Rocky Sand, we're then going to dry brush over this, just adding a little bit of texture, and a little bit of contrast, and a little bit more colour. And once we've done this, we're then going to go back over those rocks that we sculpted before, using the initial brown colours, and we're going to just layer this up with, again, a little bit of rough wet blending. Highlights on the areas that are going to be under the light from the top. The next stage is washing the base itself. We're making our own homemade wash using some Liquitex ink, so the transparent burnt umber. And we're going to mix this with some homemade equivalent of Lahmian medium, and it's just some matte medium by Liquitex mixed down with water, 9 parts to 1. So you could give that a good mix, good couple of drops of ink, and wash that across the entire base. Don't worry too much about the finish with this. If there is a slight bit of a gloss, we're using a combination of Game Colour and Vallejo Model Colour paints, which are going to have different finishes. Some are matte, some are more satin. We can apply a matte or satin varnish through the airbrush later on, which is going to homogenise all of these. To add a little bit more detail, we're then going to go over it with a really fine dry brush of dark sand and just make sure that we take off any of those really black spots. That's the base finally finished, so let's move on to Boba Fett himself. I'm going to start off with a really nice fine brush and paint in some of the details that are in black, again using Vallejo model colour black. The main thing's the insert of the visor. You could put this with a different colour, but it's quite striking if you use the old Star Wars colours where he's got that really clear black visor. Now we've finished that detail, we're going to go and paint the fatigues in using some Vallejo Silver Grey. At least 2 thin coats for this. What we will then end up doing is we'll end up progressively going through highlighting. I might not actually show that on the video, but we're just going to mix a little bit of ivory in with that and get progressively lighter highlights, especially with some of the fabrics in the pockets. Next, using some US Dark Green by Vallejo, we're going to paint his cape and also his body armour and helmet in this colour. Again, mixing this down with either a bit of white or a bit of ivory to add highlights so that we can actually go back and either layer or do some wet blending. We will do a little bit of wet blending on the cape later on with some lime green, but the main thing with the panels is just making sure that we get a nice even coat. I've gone ahead and finished with the green and some of the highlights, and we're going to go back now and go over some of the details with Sun Yellow. All I've done here is just base with Sun Yellow, and then we can mix in a little bit of Moon Yellow or a lighter Lemon Yellow to then put the highlights across the top of it. Again, edge highlighting and doing a little bit of layering on some of the panels that are going to be visible to the eye. Next step after that would be to move on to Mephiston Red. It's probably one of my favourite red colours. Moving around all the details, I tend to use an Evil Sun Scarlet to highlight Mephiston Red, using the Citadel colours. It's just got really good coverage and it's probably one of the best red paints that you'll find on the market. We're now going to paint the weapons using Vallejo German Grey. They'll be finished off later on using a dry brush of silver. I find German Grey is just a nicer finish than using black and your traditional grey highlighting, especially on Star Wars miniatures. It just looks a bit more realistic. And as I said before, we're now going back through and wet blending part of the cape using some lime green by Vallejo and just blending that back into the US dark green. We all work slightly differently when we're painting, especially when you're painting individual miniatures, and I tend to work backwards and forwards across my wet palette. With this stage, I'm just going through with some, like a tan beige colour, and highlighting some of the yellow, especially the bits that are going to be reflecting light, and doing a little bit of volumetric highlighting through some of the pauldrons on the shoulders. We're next going through and painting the boots and his equipment belt using Vallejo Saddle Brown. We will then mix in a little bit of ivory in this and do some edge highlighting, some volumetric highlights on some of the pouches as well with a really fine brush. One of the final steps is going through and painting the jump pack. We're going to use Dark Silver by Acrylic. We'll go through after this and do a dry brush highlight with silver and then a very light dry brush highlight with bronze, both by Acrylic, and we're going to highlight the weapons as well. Done the bulk load of painting, there's a few things that I've done off camera, so I've gone back through and put a little bit of a black wash over some of the red, just to mute it a little bit more, and then also gone in with an airbrush using some Sun Yellow and Hot Orange to do some OSL lighting from behind. The final little trick I did before I finished the miniature was used some pigment powder, so used a selection of different pigment powders, mixed them up and used some flow improver just to add a little bit more sandy texture to the rocky base. It's that time then. Shall we unveil the miniature? guys, I really appreciate you taking the time. If you've managed to watch it this far through, I really appreciate if you just like the video and potentially go and have a look at our Instagram. So it's at The Distant Fail, and just have a look at some of the miniatures. You might get some inspiration. You might want to commission.